I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
And finally, we're back.
Oh.
After an extended absence, Dave, Concavity Show returns with episode number
67.
67.
Which is going to be with Christian TeBordo, but we're just doing a little intro riff here before we get to the conversation because it has been a little while since we did this, Matt. I was a little bit rusty coming into this, I feel like. Our last episode was Dario Diofebi, and I don't know when that was, a few months ago maybe. You were kind of busy during that time though, so we really didn't have a chance to get together. So tell us a bit about what you've been up to.
I was kind of busy, and I apologize for my absence in April, May, June. And I was really, on sabbatical for the whole month of June from my job, and spent a lot of April and May finalizing a lot of the details for the David Foster Wallace conference here in Austin, which took place June 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. And I would say we also had some potential guests that didn't work out, or we had some, books that maybe we wanted to cover in that time, and we ended up having to reschedule and push out. So we still do have a lot of plans to interview authors, and, the show isn't going away. We've got a lot of great things lined up in future episodes.
Yeah,
we've just been slow. So. This is not either one of us is like our full-time job. I think Dave, you've actually changed full-time jobs since we've.
Yeah, I changed employers in January. So I used to work for a private online school. Now I work for the public district of Saanich, which is a area in Victoria, basically.
Not so fully online.
I've been TOCing in a variety of classrooms in person, including
what is TOC?
Classes like teacher on call, subbing, substitute tutor. I've been in like English classes, senior English or junior high English. I've taught drama. Weirdly, it's not a subject area I teach. I taught a grade 1 class one afternoon. I taught a Science 9 class, so like pretty off the wall stuff. But then I had a very short contract at the online school that is run by the Saanich School District for the last few weeks. So I was in the same office every day with the same people. It was great. But yeah, it's a very different pace of life than what I've been used to for like the last decade of just working from home as an online teacher. Yeah. Well, so and that's been a big shakeout.
We want to thank everyone who's stuck with us during this hiatus, this break that we've been on for a few months, but we are back. And like I say, we have this great conversation with Christian TeBordo today, and we have some future guests already lined up and scheduled on the calendar and books in hand. So we're going to continue pretty much as fast and furious as we can after this. I did want to give a brief, rundown of the conference.
Totally.
Because, we started out our life as a David Foster Wallace podcast. And this is probably one of the biggest.
That's how our marriage began.
That's right. We've grown apart in some ways. No. But this conference.
We're seeing a counselor.
Was one of our biggest. It was one of my biggest dreams in life was to bring the David Foster Wallace conference to Austin. And I had planned to do that in 2020. And that conference was canceled due to COVID. And really canceled again in 2021. And we did have a Wallace conference in October of 2021 in Amsterdam. But the conference we had here in June, about a month ago, was the first Wallace conference on American soil in over 3 years.
Yeah.
So we did not go to the one in 2019 in Illinois that was pretty sparsely attended. As a very small conference. But the one in 2022, I got to say, went very well. And I didn't record anything.
I get
there.
That impression. Unfortunately, did not make it. But
Dave was not there, but a lot of other people were. A lot of our former guests on the show.
Yeah,
I'm going to
tons and tons.
Go through some of that. But
That's one of my great heartbreaks of 2022. Probably the greatest heartbreak is that I was not able to make it to this conference.
I'm
And
really going to try to not to
I
rub it
really,
in.
I really died inside that weekend.
But you know,
Just to be honest with you.
I'm biased, but it was probably the best conference I've ever
Yeah,
been to.
I'm sure it was, and I really
Um,
appreciated like the level of like visibility that was happening during the conference. Like I was felt like I was seeing a lot from the Wallace Society on Instagram and Twitter. Like the updates were just really fresh,
yeah.
and even though I wasn't able to be there, it felt like I got a really good taste or a good sense of what it was like to be there. So big shout out to Andrea for updating the Instagram and you know making it feel like I sort of got a sense of what was going on each day. So that was cool.
Yeah, she did a great job. And one consequence of not having the conference for 2 years was that it gave us extra planning time. And
Sure.
one of the
Yeah.
lessons I learned from this was really like if you do spend a lot of time planning something, and it can actually go really well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of contingency planning, but if you have time to sweat all of the details and make things as good as possible, it can actually like work out. And I'm really grateful to everyone who showed up to the conference in Austin. Like I say, it was June 2nd, 3rd, and 4th at the University of Texas, co-sponsored by the Harry Ransom Center, sponsored a bit by Zero Gram Press. Um, and the English department here was super helpful to me at
Oh, awesome.
UT, including the chair of the Department of English, Martin Kevorkian, who pretty much attended the whole conference,
Wow, cool.
and gave one of our opening speeches. And so I want to do a little bit of a recap because I didn't record anything there. I was busy
Right.
kind of
Running the conference.
running
and
the
shit?
conference and making sure things went smoothly. I didn't have time
Yeah.
to kind of sit down and do a formal recording as we've done in the past.
Yeah.
So I want to go through a little bit of that now, and also because you weren't there, Dave.
Yeah.
I could speak to
I,
you.
I want you to just like hit me with a tsunami wave recap
All right.
of everything
Well,
that went down that was awesome.
I'll start out by saying, you know, by the end of it, I was actually like really emotional, and
Yeah, I bet.
I didn't
I bet.
expect. I honestly didn't expect this at all because I just been focused on printing the program and the name tags, and will we get catering access, and all when
Yeah.
are people going to deliver the food and stuff. And by the end of it, I was like, holy shit, people actually had a good time, and like maybe not just a good time, maybe like a lot of people had a really good time. And
Like a formative time, made really good friends. And
yeah, that's
cool,
like
new.
I hadn't really
connections
given
and
any
stuff.
thought to that, and like
Yeah.
looking back on it, I don't want to exaggerate, but this is like maybe one of the best weekends of my adult life. It was
That's
that
awesome,
good.
man. I'm so glad to hear that because you put so much work into this thing.
Well,
So you deserve
like I
that.
say, it paid off, and it's because I'm passionate, about this community, and I love, bringing these people together. It's been good for, my soul in the past to be around
Yeah.
them, but like
Yeah.
the fact that everyone showed up, and the people who came were also positive and engaged and on the same page. There was just no like weirdness to me. Everyone was like very cool, and smart, and like I learned a lot. So I have printed out a copy of the program here, and I'm just gonna like run through some of the. I do want to mention like pretty much all the presenters. There's only like 30 names,
Yeah.
but I bet you half of them are people that we have talked about on the show or had on the show
Right.
before.
As guests, yeah.
So, the panels were part of the experience. There was maybe about 60 people total in attendance, and like half of them presenters, maybe 30 spread across 3 days. So that's really only like 10-ish people presenting per day.
That's a nice amount, not too much.
Yeah, well, and you don't miss everyone is in one room basically.
Yeah.
You don't miss anything. And you're not really rushed for time, and there's plenty of breaks, and you don't have to start at 8 a.m. and you don't have to go till 6 p.m. So everyone was pretty flexible with the time. And we had a mix of writers and academics. So there was some panels that were just almost like a book festival, right? Like a Q&A with an author. and then some mixed in with, academic stuff about David Foster Wallace. So I'm going to run through it. Day one, first panel of the day was Michael O'Connell, and a guy named Jay Ford. And Michael O'Connell, we were just talking about privately, Dave, because he's got a new book coming out called Conversations with George Saunders that he edited, Michael O'Connell edited.
That's right. And he was briefly on the show for one of our previous
conference recaps, right?
Yeah. And we've talked about him lots.
Right. And he was talking about Buddhism and Saunders, and
cool.
Another guy on the panel who I really enjoyed meeting named Jay Ford was talking about Jesuits and Fogel. So that was a really strong panel that we started the day off, and that was moderated by our friend and former guest, Chris Piekarski.
Yeah, that makes sense. Big
Buddhist
guy.
The next panel was Corey Hudson and Ryan Kerr, both like longtime
yes
conference attendees.
Absolutely.
All moderated by Alex Moran. And we moved some things around, so I'm not going to go through I'm just going off what the printed program was. We also had Ryan Blank there, who has been many conferences in the past.
I actually had correspondence with him well before we started the Great Concavity, because I saw that he came out with a book called something in the title had to do with a supposedly fun thing, but it was a riff on
supposedly fun things.
Yeah, that's it. And I just I saw it on Facebook, and I just messaged him, and I was like, "Hey, you must be a Wallace fan. I am too." And we just riffed, and then we emailed, and So
and he's a really nice guy.
I'm sorry I missed Ryan. Yeah,
and his book was for sale there. We did.
Needed the Lego Infinite Jest
Infinite Lego
book as well, which I have. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was on a panel with a guy named Saul Leslie Saul was talking about disability, which was really fascinating. I don't know if there's ever been a Wallace paper on disability. And Saul is a student of David Herring's, so in the UK.
Cool. Yeah.
So he came over from Liverpool. And the first day we also had Deb Olin Unferth do a reading, so former guest of ours.
I'm really sad I missed meeting her. She seems so cool.
She was so cool and fun, and Mike Miley interviewed her, and she talked about a short story that she wrote called Deb Olin Unferth, and it's if you haven't read it, it's an absolutely hilarious
Is it different
story.
from the one Deb Olin Unferth is not a fuck up?
That's the story.
Or is it that one? That's the one. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Deb Olin Unferth is not a fuck up. At the Wallace conference. Deb Olin
we actually didn't talk about that with her when we talked to her, but we totally should have.
I know, but
so good.
Mike did at the conference.
Good.
We also had a really interesting panel at the end of that day, moderated by Andrea. That was, and I should say Danielle moderated Ryan's panel with Saul. But Alex Moran did a paper on David Markson and Dingus McGee, Ballad of Dingus McGee, which was hilarious because he said the word dingus 100 times.
Yeah, Alex would do that because he's a hilarious British man.
Yeah, exactly. But it was a really good
humor ever.
paper on David Markson. And then
sweet.
Tim Person did one on Stanley Cavell and Romanticism.
Yeah.
And so, again, our former guest, Tim Person, getting to have him there.
His first Wallace conference. I'm so excited for him.
Man.
And we were texting but lead up hey, should we get the same flight down together? Because we live in the same city, and just didn't work out for me this time. But
well, you should debrief with him. Yeah, you should debrief with him.
We've been talking about going out for a beer soon. So
I really enjoyed getting to meet him, and his paper was amazing.
He's lovely.
And it was really smart. It actually had a lot to do with, in addition to Cavell and Romanticism, Henry David Thoreau was in there with Romanticism. Also on that panel was our Polish friend from Poland named Jarek Hetman. And Jarek's paper was all on Pink Floyd, and it was wild. I will.
Can't say I know a lot about Pink Floyd in general. That sounds cool.
Well, there's a lot of, as he called them, echoes in the work of Pink Floyd. Obviously, Wallace being a kind of a stoner in the 70s, very familiar with the Pink Floyd. And Pink Floyd directly does show
Wastoid,
up in some of Wallace's work.
Right.
And then that night was our keynote, Jennifer Egan. And, Jennifer Egan being there was just wonderful, just pretty amazing. Sick. Her talk was amazing. And, she signed books in the Ransom Center, and we had a what's the word I'm looking for? Reception you know, in,
Oh, yeah.
the galleries. And then the second day, we had we were supposed to have Brandon Hobson. That was one of the bad parts. Brandon had to cancel
he had
due
to bail because
a
of
COVID exposure. That was only one of the
that's
only
so
down
sad.
parts. But kind of the keynote of that day was Jim Gower. And Jim Gower reading. It was actually his first ever public reading of reading from his own
that's
work.
not surprising actually.
Reading from novel Explosives. And
What was the passage that he read? Do you remember what it was about?
I'll have to get you the page number, but it was it was from the middle of the book, and it was about Raymond. There's a description of the small town in Mexico, and it was a great description of this small town. I'll have to come back to you on that. I feel bad.
Cool. No, that's fine. That's enough.
We also had that day a panel on Manuel Puig, which was very interesting, with Caleb Sanford.
Is that Kiss of the Spider Woman? Is that his?
Yes, although we talked about other works of his.
Cool.
And a woman named Sage Ingberg, and Sage and Caleb also coincidentally not just wrote on Puig, but both from Colorado, or living in Colorado at the same time. Kind of crazy.
That's cool.
We had a Canadian paper, Role of Canada in Infinite Jest, by a guy named Gianluca Bertoia. And Gianluca was just an amazing guy to meet, super interesting guy. His paper was fantastic. You would have loved it, Dave.
Was he from Montreal?
He'd lived all over Canada, but not Montreal.
But
the French that he read,
by chance?
the French that he read was amazing. His French pronunciation was impeccable.
Wow.
We had another guy in that panel, Christopher White. Hannah Smart was there. She did an interesting thing about comedy and tragedy.
Awesome. So glad to hear Hannah made it out. I know Hannah's a huge Wallace nut on Twitter, and we've had some correspondence with Hannah. Hannah, that's great. I'm excited.
And she had been at the Amsterdam conference as well.
That's right. Yeah, I saw that. Very cool.
I got to speak through some of these people. I feel bad, but Matthew Duffus was there. Pia was there from Italy.
Yeah, Pia.
Her paper was great. Emilio's paper was amazing.
Local Austinite.
Right. And he also did a tour of the Ransom Center. He's a docent at the Ransom Center.
Oh, cool. I love that word, docent. Oh my gosh.
Joe Neary, really great paper he did on good old Neon. Really enjoyed his paper and getting to meet Joe. Ben Zimmerman's paper, as you can imagine, was incredible. Ben's super smart.
Ben's very young, right?
He's an undergrad.
Now, 21 or 2, I would guess. But he was a teenager when he started emailing us as a listener of the show, I think.
Yes. And
so cool.
I helped a bit with his his high school
That's
thesis,
right. Yeah. Totally.
Which was fantastic. But he talked a lot about Calvino and
awesome
hyper metafiction. And like I say, Jim Gower was also on that day. Which was just incredible having Jim there. And Jim stayed through the whole conference and was really engaged and asked questions of other presenters and really, didn't just show up for his reading and disappear. He stuck around the whole conference.
That's awesome. And Meredith was there with him too, right?
Meredith was there as well.
Love her.
On Saturday, we had Danielle's presentation, which was called Keep Wallace Studies Weird, which was a really great presentation, but also then combined with a game show called The Price is Water. And that was a really fun way to start out the morning.
Danielle.
And
God,
then
love her.
We had Peyton Thomas on after that. And Peyton's presentation was, he did a workshop on fan fiction. And I learned so much about the history and current state of fan fiction, which is mostly something like 60% of all fan fiction is on lesbian websites or is dominated by
interesting fact.
women and queer people.
That's cool. That's really cool.
And the history of it is a lot of like shipping of gay characters who are hetero, and like writing fiction that makes them gay, or puts them in gay situations, and so we learned a lot about the history of queer writers interacting with fan fiction. It was really fun, and we got to write our own fan fiction and share it.
I heard about that. And Peyton is the like enigmatic figure behind the American Doll Instagram account that keeps posting Hal Incandenza as like an American doll.
And Hal Incandenza was there. We
had a lot of back and forth, Peyton and I, through the Society Instagram. He's like, I can't believe you keep liking my photos. Like, how is this a thing that the Wallace Society is interested in this stuff that I'm posting? Awesome.
And Peyton is also the author of like a really fantastic YA novel. The novel was there and sold out. I wish we'd had more copies of that book. I did one panel that day, which was moderating or doing like a Q&A with Dario. So Dario DFW was there. And like Jim, Dario was there the whole conference and super engaged. And like his reading was fantastic. He did different voices of the different characters in the book.
Oh, cool.
And I really, enjoyed getting to talk to him again about Paradise, Nevada.
Yeah.
And it was really just an honor, to have him there. A lot of the rest of that day was about film. So we had Steve Lively, who I feel like I've known online forever, do a paper about John Krasinski's movie, which not a lot of people have actually done critical work on. Like, is Krasinski's movie so bad? All the time, right? Yeah, and it's like, well, why is it so bad? And Steve Lively went into that. And then
I'm sorry, I missed Steve. Meeting Steve.
Yeah, it was great.
A big supporter of us.
And then Matt Luter's paper about cable fiction and Tristan and televisual mythology was, as you can imagine, just lights out, like just so good. Totally. And really, like, Matt just needs to keep doing more stuff on cable fiction because no one does it better than him. And like, there's not really a book of academic cable fiction. So it was so good. And Michelle Martin was also on that panel, and her paper was amazing about Eternal Sunshine, one of my favorite movies. That's right.
Yeah, I love it.
And Brief Interview number 20, which is one of my favorite pieces of Wallace's writing, and Eternal Sunshine.
Which one's that again?
The Granola Cruncher.
Yeah, okay. I had a feeling, but I just wanted to.
And then we had like 3 other great things on this day happen. One was, maybe at least 2. One was our last panel of the day was Milena Duchovny from Argentina, and she did a paper on David Cronenberg's Videodrome, and we actually screened the whole movie of Videodrome before her paper, which is like an hour and a half movie. And I've just never been to a conference before where it's like, oh, we're going to do a paper on this movie. Let's just show the movie.
I bet Mike Miley loved that. He's such a nut for that director.
It's a pretty bananas movie. If you haven't seen it, like there's
heard that. I've not seen it.
Sexual violence going on in the movie, some actual violence, some really creepy body horror stuff going on. And some people, it was a little too much for. Like, it was some content warnings we had to put out there. But her paper was, combined with, or her looked at Infinite Jest as well, and body horror stuff. And there's a
definitely
lot.
Some of that.
Well, and televisual stuff too, and fascism. Like, there's a lot going on in both of those artworks. The other big thing of that day in the afternoon is we had the world premiere of Justin Warsh's movie, which is called Extended Play, or a trailer for Infinite Jest, the motion picture. And Justin created this trailer for Infinite Jest that is sort of like if Infinite Jest was made into a movie and then you cut it down into a trailer. This is like the 3 or 4 minute like long version of the trailer. Right. And it was shot on film, not on digital video, and edited, over a period of time. He's been working on this for like 3 or 4 years. And he had brought a lot of props and storyboards from the movie. And so we had one room in the conference center that was like devoted to the props from the movie, which were, really amazing, like late 80s, early 90s aesthetic, like the cartridge,
Right.
even the ETA
the
logo
Enfield
shirts.
Tennis shirts
right?
were like super 90s looking. Yeah.
Yeah, and like the Infinite Jest playing on this old kind of looking monitor, and he had a costume of a guy in a wheelchair like a mannequin, and the veil, he had custom created these veils like for Madame Psychosis. But
Yeah.
the movie itself, I think, will be in wider release soon online, and I hope everyone gets to see it because it's probably, it is not just probably, it is the best adaptation visually of Infinite Jest that I've ever seen. And so the fact that we got to premiere that at the conference was amazing. So I know I've talked too long about this, but again, if you don't like it, we'll give you the time code. You can skip ahead to the Christian TeBordo interview, probably like 30 minutes in. But it was a big deal for me.
The title of this episode will be episode 67, Christian TeBordo brackets and a lot about DFW22.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, I could talk about it for days.
Is Justin going to team up with Michael Schur, do you think? Pitch him this 4-minute clip and be like, let's work on this together?
It's really its own thing. It's really its own thing.
Does he have any intention to like make it into a
it's a really fully formed thing, even though it's it's not a feature. I think that's part of the reason why maybe Infinite Jest would never be a great film, but it would be a good movie trailer. Like it could be a good trailer, like 3 or 4 minutes,
or a good like mini series.
Even that, it's not going to be as good.
Could
as
be. Oh yeah,
it's too much going on in the book.
That's the problem with adaptations, almost always. Yeah.
But so thank you to everyone who came to the conference. Again, there's too many people to name. I could go through the list of everyone who did attend. I didn't even mention all the moderators, in here. Rob Short, Grace Chipperfield, Alex Moran, all the people who helped out, on the committee. Corey Hudson, Andrea, Amelia was a big help to me. Mike Miley was a big help to me. Megan Barnard, Martin Kevorkian, Allard, Diego. Everyone who helped was just really so great to me, and I'm so proud of the way that it turned out.
That's awesome, man. So happy that it went so swimmingly. Did Diego make it to the conference? Was he there?
No, but he was on a lot of our planning committees. He was on a lot of our planning. So
sweet. Who came the furthest? Was it Grace Chipperfield?
Grace Chipperfield, Adelaide,
she came
Australia.
The furthest from anywhere in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we did have people there.
Her commitment's outstanding.
Like I say, from Italy, Poland, Argentina, the UK, Canada. So for only like 60 people, we still had it represented like 7 countries, 8 countries. And that means a lot too. And that shows a lot of, diversity in our attendees.
That's awesome. Very cool.
Several from Canada. Actually, Jean-Luc lives in Canada, and Peyton lives in Canada. Tim Person lives in Canada.
Peyton lives in Canada?
Yep.
Where?
Toronto, I think. Toronto.
Ah, cool. So, I didn't know that. Sweet. Well, should have been one more Canadian, for fuck's sake. But
next time we'll announce some future dates.
Way of living.
We did announce, the 2023 conference will be in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Vern Sisney is our chair. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania is like kind of near Baltimore, DC, Philadelphia. It's not like near a major airport, so it will involve some driving. We got to figure that out a bit. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to go into Baltimore or DC or Philadelphia. I got to figure that out, but probably DC. But we will have a good time at Gettysburg College, and we're in the advanced stages of having that conference planned out completely. So we do hope people make the trip to Gettysburg next summer.
Yeah, we will definitely plug that as the day gets closer.
Yep.
Here on the show for sure. Cool.
All right, let's get to Christian TeBordo.
Wonderful conference. Yeah, we have Christian TeBordo coming up. Here's our interview. Before we do, I just want to say, Matt, happy anniversary. 1 year this month as Concavity Show. since we
Oh,
kind
look
of
at
like did a little switch or whatever. Without further ado, I guess here's us talking to Christian TeBordo about the apology. Okay, well, welcome everybody to episode 67 of Concavity Show. We are here again with Christian TeBordo. Christian, welcome back. You were our guest exactly 2 years ago this month, July 2020, and that was episode 55. So it's great to have you back, man. Thanks for coming.
It's great to be here. Thank you. I missed you guys.
Yeah, we've missed you too, man. So much so that I've listened to all your podcast appearances this week, just to like refresh and get reacquainted with you, and just been excited for this conversation for a long time.
So you're telling me I can't repeat any stories?
Well, you can. Other people won't know you're repeating them. I'm not going to flag them, so don't worry. I'm not going to sell you out.
I would actually encourage you, if you have any good answers, to repeat them from previous podcasts.
You got it.
Sure, you've probably polished them and stayed awake at night thinking about how you might answer differently. I know I would. Not if I was you. I just mean for myself.
Yeah, I was watching clips of a Willie Nelson concert last night on the 4th of July, and I was thinking, this dude has played the same songs at every concert he's ever done for like the past 48 years. And does he ever get tired of singing the same songs? Like Always on My Mind, Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, Whiskey River. It's the same set list almost for 40 years. And
when was Willie's last album?
But if you went to a Willie Nelson concert and he didn't play On the Road Again, you'd be like, what the fuck? So I encourage people, it takes, I think, great courage and bravery to keep playing the same old hits year after year. So I would encourage you. No, welcome. So Christian, we're here to talk about your new book, The Apology, which was published in 2021 from Astrophil Press at the University of South Dakota. And Christian, for those of maybe who didn't join us 2 years ago in the middle of COVID when we were talking about Ghost Engine, Christian TeBordo is author of 6 previous books, including the novel Tufflahoma, which we also talked about. Tufflahoma was the winner of the Rescue Press Open Prose Series Award. And Ghost Engine, Book of Stories, which won the Bright Edge Fiction Prize. He used to live in Chicago, now lives in upstate New York. Christian, thank you again for being here with us today.
Thank you.
So The Apology.
Yeah, you've been kind of busy lately. Busy year for you. You just moved states, moved jobs, put out a book. Anything else? Anything else exciting that's been going on for you?
It's not enough. I'm going to look at houses tomorrow. So
whoa, yeah, real estate. Let's go. Yeah. That is exciting. Very cool. What precipitated the move? Was it job related primarily?
It was family wanted to be my son really wanted to be back among his extended family, and I was kind of burned out on academia and.
Sure. That seems reasonable.
Yeah, and so my priority being my family and then my writing, I felt like the best thing for me was to just kind of move on.
Yeah, cool. Are you back in the world of marketing again, or doing something like academia?
In a manner, I'm doing writing for a university, but it's a technical writing, like a science writing, but it is kind of marketing based, but it's more journalistic this time. So
okay, cool. Are you excited about that job change?
I'm loving it so far. They leave me alone in a room all day to write. And I spent the last week figuring out what protein folding is and then explaining how it's relevant to the contemporary life. And
that actually comes up quite a bit in the biography of David Foster Wallace, which is DT Max, which his
protein folding.
Yes, because DT Max previously wrote a book called The Family That Couldn't Sleep about a disease called fatal familial insomnia, which is a prion disease, which is prions is related to the way proteins fold. So protein folding is the cause of a lot of degenerative neurological diseases and fatal, usually fatal incurable diseases. Mad cow disease, any kind of prion disorder is really scary because there's no cure and really maybe no way to prevent getting some of these that are hereditary. So protein folding, I did learn about from DT Max.
See, it's very literary.
Very literary.
Way to tie it back to the old guy. That's amazing.
Horrible disease of someone who couldn't sleep. Like literally.
Oh yeah, that sounds.
It affects like
horrific.
a small clan in Italy. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the apology. The apology. I got to tell you, Christian, when I picked this book up and started reading it, fucking loved it.
Yeah, it was like I just read it in like 2 to 3
absolutely
sittings.
love this book, and it's so different than all your other work. It feels like so different, and not to say that like I didn't like your other work too. I love it. We've talked about it.
Yeah, we got pretty. We really pumped your tires on the last time about Ghost Engine. I listened back to it today, and I was like, oh yeah, we made Christian feel good, I think, and that's what we're here to do, is to make you look exciting.
But I feel like you're taking a lot of risks in those stories, and you're trying a lot of experimental ideas and really pushing the envelope. And in a way, this felt much more controlled. Obviously, it's more realistic. It's more straightforward. It's an office novel in some ways. It's a philosophical novel.
It's nothing like wildly off the wall, like magic wise. It's like it's pretty much like realism, I would say.
But it's deeply philosophical, and we'll get into some of that. But I was kind of surprised. So walk us through, when you're writing, when you're trying a story, did this start out as just a story, or was this an idea that kind of came to you fully formed?
Definitely nothing has ever come to me fully formed, I don't think so. But I mean, I probably said in our last interview that things usually start with a line for me.
Yes, right. And like an opening line.
Yeah. And I actually started with, if you want to get to the bottom of this stalking business, you should talk to Kit Carson. And within 3 pages, I was on the chemical warfare stuff. So I went back and put that in front and then moved forward.
Oh, yeah.
And so it really was very, very freestyle. But there was, in this sense, a kind of intent to this actually was written before Tufflahoma.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. So this is like you wrote this like 6-ish years ago, 7-ish years ago, and then kind of reworked it in the last while.
No, I think I had an absolute finished draft about 6 years ago. The first draft was probably about a decade ago.
Yeah. Wow.
And I had done 3 very, very weird books, and had started to get a little bit of attention for those earlier books, and was like, the weirdest thing I could do right now is to write something entirely set in the real world that nobody has to ask how or what happened. You know what I mean? And so there was a kind of, as un-Olympian as it sounds, that there was an actual generic constraint involved, which is don't let yourself fly off the handle. And so I don't know if you'll remember there's a scene where, to me, it's a very trippy scene late in the novel when his father suddenly shows up, and things start to seem a little off and weird. But there's nothing that couldn't conceivably happen, and that was my constraint for this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like an epiphany moment in that scene. You're like, oh, now I understand the context of the protagonist Mike Long's like living situation. I didn't realize that he lived with his father until this scene. It comes quite a bit later in the book, right? So there are a few like pieces of that scene that kind of blow your mind a bit, but it's not like levitation or anything like that.
And there's also a scene late in the book, or there's a line right in the book where, it's hard to talk about this book without not spoiling it, but there's a scene later in the book where he's at the sort of climax in the book and imagining what could have happened. And I almost felt like you were on the precipice of like, and I imagined it all. It was all just a dream. But you don't go that far. It's like, imagine, and then stop right at the edge of what a character is imagining, rather than like the whole the writer has imagined the whole thing,
right?
Even though it is like
edging
imagined,
fiction.
obviously it's not a documentary that we're reading.
Let's rewind maybe a little bit and give listeners a context. Like, what is this book about? What is kind of, who are the characters? What's the plot? And that
I feel like it was tough to summarize. Like, whoever wrote the jacket copy.
Yeah, how would you give like a couple sentence recap of this book, Christian or Matt?
I honestly think Matt, if you want to take a crack at it, you're welcome to.
I was actually struggling with this.
It's hoping to pit you against each
Actually, I
other.
feel like whoever wrote the jacket copy on this did a pretty good job, because the little blurb that's on the back of the galley is really good. But it is, I would describe it as an office novel. It is about a guy. It's a first-person narrative of a guy who describes himself as a philosopher, maybe amateur philosopher, and he gets caught up in a situation with a woman in the office, and the apology is a reference to Plato's apology, Socrates' dialogue. So there's definitely the philosophy stuff we'll talk about, and the
Like in the Greek
Chili's
sense,
plays a
apology,
serious role in the
like,
book.
yeah.
I do want to talk about some
As does Applebee's.
Frosty Margs and skillet queso at Chili's.
Subway also does. So a lot of American restaurant chains show up in this book too.
Yeah, there.
I'm curious to mind their relationship to philosophers like Hegel and Wittgenstein and Nietzsche that you bring up in the book.
Descartes.
Well, I mean, it's
Descartes.
as this is just total nerdery, but the reason that those restaurants keep coming back is because I was trying to evoke repetition by Kierkegaard, like the concept of whether you could create a repetition, but
Eternal return.
Through pitchers of beer.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on. I actually think there's a lot going on here in this book with a really relatively simple setup. I think in the first few pages, a reader might liken it to some of like Being John Malkovich, or bits of like Office-based characters, and then clearly you get in the head of this one guy, and you do get a lot of his backstory. And the thing is written as a sort of a confession, a defense of his actions. So it's written almost like retroactively after something has happened.
Yeah. It feels to me a little bit like I recently reread The Outsiders because I was teaching it to like 8th grade students or 9th grade students, 8th grade. And, at the end of The Outsiders, like you get this kind of mind-blowing moment where you realize that the whole book that you've just read was an assignment for an English teacher. And like the book restarts, and then the whole first like intro sentence series gets rewritten, and you're like, oh, and you flip back and you're like, whoa, that's cool. There's almost kind of like a recursive element in this book as well. I'm not going to spoil that too much, but that's sort of like like Matt was saying, like it's kind of like a callback, like sort of a remembrance, like a journal entry style to this book.
Yeah, no,
so it's recounts the events leading up to the event.
Yeah, I mean, and that was the only thing that I was having trouble. The thing that took me a while, like from the completion of the first draft to the very last draft, was I hadn't decided where the narrator was at the end. So, I mean, maybe I won't spoil it. I'm not that big on that, but it is kind of key to understanding the book and key to any tension in the book as to where he's telling you the story from. So
maybe we can put up like a spoiler shield near the end of the conversation. We'll say, okay, like we're going to talk about the ending now. So if you haven't read the book and you don't want spoilers, like stop now, write down the time signature, come back later after you finish reading it. And, okay, go.
Well, I think in a way it's a spoiler alert just to say that it's related to Socrates. And if anyone is familiar with how Socrates' trial works out, and, there's a little, you have already mentioned chemical weapons, which in Socrates' case is a chemical called hemlock.
Plant.
And it's a pretty great chemical weapon, homemade chemical weapon in this
chlor ammo.
But give us some of your thoughts. So I mean, your interest in philosophy, I think, comes through in a lot of your work, but it's pretty differently handled here. Give us some of just where your head was at when you, I don't know, wanted to engage with Descartes and Plato and Socrates and apparently Kierkegaard.
William Ockham comes up.
Well, so Kierkegaard gets one mention in the book, one direct mention in the book,
and an epigraph too, right?
Yes, and I mean Kierkegaard's my hero, but he's also his whole thing is indirect communication. You know what I mean? And to some degree, I was trying to rewrite the Seducer's Diary, which is the kind of philosophical novella that ends the first half of his book, either or. But I wanted to write it as though the seducer believed himself to be in control of the situation, but actually was not in control of the situation, that the seducee was actually in control. But that's much too heady. Like the philosophical jokes, to the extent that they work, should work because I don't believe in communicating directly, and my narrator has less ability to manipulate that, and so he's wrong about just about everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
like he's kind of a tool, the narrator, right?
Yeah.
He's kind of like a toxic masculinity figure in a lot of ways, right? Like his brain voice is kind of gross. So that I have some questions related to that too. But yeah, like, you're filtering this philosophical stuff through a guy who's
Actually,
kind
I don't
of
think
a
he's
tool,
that
and he's, like,
bad.
not
I
really
think you're
well
being too
trained.
harsh on this guy. I don't think he's that bad. I mean,
I think he's worse at the beginning, and then as the book goes on, you start to feel more sympathy for him.
I don't know. I think that
But there are some moments
he
for
clearly
sure where
restrains
you're like, this
himself,
guy's
though. He could
brain
have.
voice sucks.
But his action, again, it's actions versus words, and like his actions, he clearly restrains himself from the very worst of what he could do, and I actually found myself rooting for him, and like I actually really wanted him to be successful in his seduction, but he wasn't the one being like, he was the seduced, right? It was flipped, and that he, even though he was maybe a stalker, I didn't find that like really that bad. Like I just found that it's like
There's a great
everyday stalking, like that just in the days of like Facebook stalking, it's like
Sure,
not that
right.
bad.
Yeah, that's true. There's such a great building of tension in this book about like the new girl in the office. I'm air quoting girl because there's a whole thing around that. The new woman in the office who gets hired, and the tension about Mike, the protagonist, like actually getting to see her is such a slow, like long build, and it's a great payoff. It's like so cathartic when it finally resolves because you've been waiting for so long, and the tension is built so extremely. But yeah, like he's kind of a tool. He's kind of like maybe a despicable narrator, some people might say, but like maybe not as bad as like Humbert. Like he's not like a massive pedophile or something.
I don't think
but
he
like,
does that much bad stuff. Honestly, I think he's a. I think you're.
I'm splitting the difference. Like I mean, I have to sympathize with him to some degree because all of his thoughts come from me. You know what I mean? So
I know, where do you like? What ether are you tapping into to like put this guy's brain voice on the page? Is it kind of like like G.K. Chesterton story where he was asked by like a famous London newspaper to like write a big piece on what was wrong with the world, and he just wrote back, "Dear sirs, I am." It's this kind of very like Christian idea of like, I'm a sinner, I recognize my fallenness, kind of a thing. Is there an element of that to the brain voice? Because I know that you have a very like deep theological background. I mean, Matt, here I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. Like the words tits and ass are used quite frequently in the book in reference to women and women having them. There's a section where April's walking arm in arm with him, and he says that her breasts feel like warm, soggy Cap'n Crunch. Against his
He does
arm.
use the word breasts a lot, though. I think that's.
And his pants get tight quite often.
I think that's a
and
normal
that's
male
worded in
reaction, but
various
you're
ways.
in his head. He doesn't do anything bad with that. He's not a rapist. He doesn't sexually assault anyone.
Totally.
He does get in one fist fight, but it is even the victim agrees it was justified. So
That's true. Casey does. Yeah.
I'm gonna let
They refer to women as dogs at one point. She's not a dog,
let him without sin
So-
cast the first stone on that.
Hey man, I'm not saying that.
But it's funny that you guys are no longer explicitly devoted to the work of DFW because, I was like not fully prepared to elaborate last time, but I thought about brief interviews constantly while writing this.
Yeah, okay, that makes a great deal of sense to me that Mike Long could be one of the hideous men.
Yeah, I used to joke that book would have been more daring if he had just called it Brief Interviews with Men, just because I think they were hideous, but there's also a lot of truth in what he was describing there, and
But like
I was
all
just trying to
men are
look at that,
hideous? Yeah.
Well, and I think some of the office parts too get to the the sort of boredom of life in the Pale King 2, which is an office novel. And you clearly have some experience with this, because I felt like you nailed a lot of the office culture, and just how banal and yet dramatic it seems to the people who are living in it, right? Like a lot of people I wouldn't say don't like office novels, but feel like, they just perpetuate like stereotypes. So like, how did you break out of that idea of just not doing like, I don't know, you've watched The Office, like, that there's like these stereotypical, like, here we get the sarcastic secretary or whatever. How did you deal with that?
Well, some of it was that I am actually not that familiar with the canon of The Office, like the concept Office in popular culture. So I watched, the British Office religiously. I don't think I've ever seen the American version of The Office. I've never seen Office Space. So I knew that I was probably dabbling in tropes at times. But I was trying to keep myself, for a good long time, I was trying to decide whether I was actually going to introduce the woman into the story.
Or just keep that mystery going.
And I decided that was kind of breaking the kind of rule that I had made for myself, that everything was going to have to be possible. You know what I mean? It was like too Kafkaesque to have the woman never show up. You know what I mean? And but because of that, I dragged it out as long as I could. Who knows if it was slightly too long or whatever, but that allowed me to keep what goes on a business level in the office at a certain level of abstraction. Like in the British version of The Office, they still have to talk about paper sometimes. You know what I mean? And they have to talk about paper to show you that most of the time they're fucking around and not talking about paper. Whereas like no one would be able to guess what is actually being accomplished in the office I'm describing. And it's supposed to kind of push you further into the head of my narrator. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's something that I thought you were very good at, keeping at bay and building, tension and suspicion around. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that idea of just building suspense, because you alluded to it with the girl whose name is April Curtis, and I went back and looked at some like Aristotle's Poetics, right, where he says in like Act 1 you're like asking a question, right? In Act 2 you're like building suspense, and then in Act 3 you sort of answer that question, like is Hamlet's father still alive, or is he a ghost? And like, I feel like you subvert that structure a bit, where you're asking a question for a long time, building suspense for a long time, and then a lot of the stuff gets answered, anticlimactically or right at the end. Do you know what I mean? So like, how were you thinking about that as a novel? Because again, I thought of you when I first read you as like primarily like short story writer, but how do you see that like structure working for you?
Well, I think I've internalized Aristotle because I may be like the only person who spent a huge chunk of his career as a creative writing teacher who still teaches Aristotle to some degree. I teach him mostly to teach against him, or to teach that this is just one of many possibilities. You know what I mean? I would often like juxtapose sections from the Poetics with like Artaud's theater of cruelty and whatnot.
Well, and I think Aristotle, even in the Poetics, says this isn't the only way. He's saying this is what I have observed the way that plays work. So
yeah, and we're still dealing with tragedy in the Poetics, and I write comedy. You know what I mean? And so the kind of it kind of begs for. But I wasn't like Wednesday corresponds to Act 3 or anything like that. But I am aware of that tradition, and this book was very difficult to sell. Like the reason that when Dave asked, I was like, Matt, you go ahead and describe it, is because
I can't describe it.
Well, I mean, part of the reason that it sat around for a while, I had agents coming at me when my first collection came out, and this was the book I had. You know what I mean? Right. And I would send them the one paragraph description I had, and they were like, "No, that's not interesting." And I've actually had small presses be like, they would read it and they would be like, "We read this because we know that you've published good work, not because of the description you sent us, and we want you to know that the book is more interesting than your description of it.
It's riding your laurels. Yeah.
Wow.
That's funny.
I mean, I kind of get that just because I think all of the best books that I've read are really hard to summarize. And no matter how long that they are, what keeps a person turning pages is like if you can identify with the voice, if the voice of it keeps you going. And this clearly did. And you mentioned the first page of it where the line that came to you is about the stalking business, talk to Kit Carson. And Kit Carson is kind of the foil of Mike, who's the protagonist. Totally. He's kind of the antagonist in a lot of ways. He's abbreviated as KC, which sounds like Casey in some ways. And I wanted to ask you about that because, like, I grew up partly in Colorado where Kit Carson's like a bit of a controversial figure. And, like, there's
a real Kit
He
Carson?
was an Old West guy, killed a lot of Indians and, settled the West and stuff.
Oh, geez.
And the real Kit Carson, there's a lot of stuff named after him, like Carson City, Nevada, Fort Carson, Colorado.
Oh, okay. Was your level of familiarity with this history high?
Yes,
going
I'm
into
just
this,
saying,
writing
there's
this
a whole
book,
count.
Christian?
You're asking me. I'm like, I thought I was being interviewed.
Did you name this character after that?
Of course.
Yeah, I definitely did. But the thing is, while aware that no frontiersman had a clean record, you know what I mean? I don't know much about him as an actual historical figure. I was directly kind of riffing on the fact that there was a totally laudatory television show about him in like I think it was the 50s or 60s. And I remember catching it on Nick at Night and, knowing that there was no chance that he was as good as presented on that show was kind of the impetus. But it's also, and this goes back to just complete generative things. It doesn't have any real bearing on the content of the novel. It also, the book enacts the history of the television show Knight Rider. Kit was the car in Knight Rider, and April Curtis and Bonnie Barstow were at various times in the series the kind of special assistants of the kind of Knight Rider operation, and they were Bonnie Barstow replaced April Curtis, and so all the names, every name in the book comes from Knight Rider.
Now this sounds like a Christian TeBordo book. It's like now this sounds like a Christian TeBordo book.
See, I totally sublimated the TeBordo-ness of it, though. You see,
totally. The interesting thing to me about that is like, when you know someone who has like the same name as a figure or a character. I knew a guy in Colorado whose name was Tom Mix, and Tom Mix is like, he was a descendant of the real Tom Mix. Tom Mix was like Old West cowboy like performer as well. Okay. And even in Infinite Jest, right? There's John, no relation Wayne. There's John Wayne, and like someone with his name, and like when I would think of Tom Mix, I'm thinking of not him, but this other person, right? There's this sort of disembodied, element where you're never fully your own identity. You're sort of embodying this other.
Yeah.
You've got this other almost like ghost that you inhabit, and
right. Well, Kit in this novel is kind of like a hick in some ways, right? Like he's got like kind of the dirty hat. He smells like cat piss, and some of his mannerisms kind of signal.
You're really
to
down
you
on
that,
this
that
guy,
he might be
man.
kind of. No, Kit. I'm talking about Kit Carson.
Oh,
don't you
Kit,
think?
for sure. I thought you were
Mike
talking about
Long,
Knight Rider.
Yeah,
I thought you were talking about Knight Rider.
No.
It's confusing because
the
there's
foil, the antagonist. I'm talking
there's
about.
Kit, and then there's Knight Rider himself, which they call him Knight Rider, Mike Rider, because he's often the designated driver. That's a lot of fun when you're talking about writing comedy rather than tragedy. Like this is definitely not a tragedy, but it is like a confession, and most like confessions you don't think of as comedic. And one, I do think I am drawn to first person narratives. Like maybe a lot of creative writing teachers would steer people away from that. I think there's maybe objectively it's harder to write third person, but I started noticing that, right away, this has got the word you in it. Like it's addressed to you. like you might.
Second person, yeah,
Right.
reader.
So like I wanted to ask you about that. Is that just, this style when you started writing first person as a confession and then addressing it to someone else? I mean, that's also like ancient Greek, I know.
Yeah, I mean, it was always intended to sound like that, and it is meant to sound like a confession, and like a much more direct confession than, for example, like Socrates' apology or whatever. But it's there's probably a vestige that was probably spurred on to some degree.
It's more like Augustinian.
Well, yeah, no, I mean that's
Yeah.
the Mike Long, the narrator, has enough delusion of grandeur to imagine that he's offering spiritual guidance to people. You know what I mean? But there's also this, there's also this sense that he's doing, he's retroactively justifying these things too. So he wants to sound like he's explaining things that were inevitable and necessary, but also is kind of covering up for things. But there was also there are vestiges there of the original idea was that Knight Rider was writing to the head of Knight Ridder newspapers, which I believe in Dutch was pronounced Knight Rider anyway, but I don't know. I don't even know if that organization exists anymore. But they used to own all the newspapers, and the idea was that he was going to be sending it to the news to be broadcast. And then I was like, that's one step too many levels of narrative, and I'll just leave the you in and let you be the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Like I said, there's a lot going on in this book. Even though it's short, I mean, I think it's probably a selling point for all those presses who missed out that it's 177 pages.
Yeah, it's very
I
short.
did, though, want to ask you a little bit more about some of the philosophy that's in here, because, again, this guy has a lot of kind of amateurish philosophical ideas that he's trying to maybe map onto his actions. And at one point, he explains an idea that comes to him about how the world doesn't really exist. And maybe the real world does exist at some point for him, but in a world that did exist, he's almost like a better person when the world doesn't exist, right? Right? Like if he has to confront the reality that all of these things did happen and they do exist, then maybe it's not so great for him. But he's able to sort of justify in a way mentally that actually it's all just, it's almost like the Matrix, like we're just a simulation or something. So I wanted to ask you about that. Where does that come from?
Well, that comes from, I said already that I'm a big Kierkegaard guy, but it's also all of my favorite philosophers, all the ones that I go back to again and again, are intensely concerned with spirituality and meaning, but also completely rooted in existence and behavior. So William James would ask, what's the actual cash value of this idea? You know what I mean? And so when I was reading Descartes, this his thought there is actually a thought that I had in Intro to Philosophy when I was exposed to the Cogito. I think therefore I am. I was like, you didn't seem to have doubted language, and if you doubt language, then you can't rebuild the world through thinking. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's weird because I asked a number of philosophers that over time, and no one seems to think that's weird. But to me, it's it seems like a complete dead end. Like you could not possibly rebuild if you were to doubt language. But maybe
seems to be
maybe
like
some
Derrida and those guys are on about, right?
Yeah, but you have smart readers. Maybe somebody will write in and school me or something like that.
Well, they should read the book first. It's available from Astrophil Press. And I do want to say that it's available now. They can order it online, and
put a link
in the show notes
best
and
get
on
it.
our social channels to order the book. I really think it's super interesting from a philosophical point of view, but also just as a role. The fiction narrative itself is just really compelling, and the whole thing, it's sort of the role of time I wanted to ask you about, because it's sort of a compressed retelling of a bunch of events, and a lot of the chapter dividers are like a certain day or the time of day, and I don't think the whole thing takes place in a week. Maybe it does. There's a lot of flashbacks, I guess, but the whole thing is, what was the idea with
I think
making
it's
it
about
like
a week, or like a 5-day work week.
Yeah, it takes place, or it's written over a week, but it takes place over his entire life. So it's
because you get a lot of his, him, like you said, as a young student, learning these things. There's even a pretty interesting debate about abortion.
From a high school English classroom flashback.
Which I read at the wrong moment.
Yeah, you wrote this 10 years ago, and boy, was it prescient about the week we're in right now.
But it's also making the point, I think, what you're saying with Descartes of like, I think, therefore I am. Can a baby make that claim? And some of your questions, like, can Descartes doubt the existence of language? Sounds a lot of like what Wittgenstein was doing, of making these wild claims of with language, or really not taking at face value what had been passed down from previous philosophers, which seemed like, this guy was really smart about. This guy meaning Mike Long, and yet maybe it doesn't work out for him.
And he's a bit playful with some of his language. Like he uses the malapropism and to be completely candid. In the context, he means candid, but he's dropping a Voltaire reference to show that he's like knows about philosophers and stuff. I love that.
Every level of the editorial process,
flag
people
that.
checked in on that. They were like, "Did you do it?"
Yeah.
It's like the copy editor, and even I even had a reviewer after he submitted the review, like, was like, I've already put in my review. Can you tell me whether this was intentional or not?
I'm pretty sure it was, based on who the narrator is and his interest in philosophy. There's also funny other malapropisms, like Casey tries to say ménage à trois, but he says mange twat. And then Mike goes into like, well, if you know French, manger, you don't spell that out exactly, but if you know a little bit of French like I do, because I'm Canadian, I know that means to eat. So there's some really funny like wordplay stuff that, depending on which character it's being applied to, it can be funny for different reasons. Like I said, Casey's kind of a hick. That's an example of his hickishness there as well.
Yeah, my guiding principle with the narrator was like that I wanted him to be able to really pull off some weird combinations, but my guiding principle was that he's not as smart as he thinks he is, but that he's not as dumb as he seems. You know what I mean? That's.
I feel like that's most people.
Yeah.
Yeah, true.
I mean, me. I hope definitely not as smart as I seem, but maybe not as dumb. Some of the time. And honestly, this is usually around the time in the interview, probably a little past where we ask for the author to read something, Dave.
Yeah, that's a great time. I was just thinking that too.
I feel like we should give the listeners a taste of what we're talking about here, because I do think your prose is really good in this, and really good being, honest with the reader. And a lot of it felt real, it felt true, but also like abstract in a way that was very intriguing, like that I wanted to keep going to see what was happening to this guy.
Yeah, and also hilarious. Definitely. I would add. There's such funny.
I mean, the whole thing with Chili's we haven't even gotten into really. So
I did a lot of research for that one.
A lot of pictures in the name of research. So, Christian, do you have a section of the book that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I'm going to read a real short passage that really doesn't need any setup, except that you should understand that the narrator, Mike Long, works in an office and digresses all the time. A long time ago, when I first started the job, or maybe a couple of months in, someone left one of those one-panel cartoons on my desk from that magazine, The New Yorker, I think, that does the one-panel cartoons that aren't funny and don't make any sense. But if you can explain to someone how they're supposed to make sense and do a convincing chuckle before or after the explanation, I can't remember which right now, they will promote you, and I've seen this happen. Okay, I didn't see it with my own two eyes, but I heard about it. The guy who got promoted was named Richard, but they called him the narrator, because legend had it he could explain to you any of those cartoons, even the one with the guy on the golf course, which is the one that got him promoted. But he was so good that right after the promotion, someone overheard him explaining the same cartoon in a bar and offered him an even better job on the spot. I can't explain to you the golf cartoon right now because I never actually saw that either, and it was so sophisticated that no one who was there can explain it to me, though they all say he made it perfectly clear and they internalized the lesson of it. Anyway, someone left one of those on my desk, Casey, I'm guessing, or one of the women in accounts who calls every handshake harassment. Or maybe it was just someone who thought I would find it funny. It showed two people, a man and a woman, sitting at a bar. The man was looking at the woman, more precisely the woman's cleavage, which was ample and deep, but you couldn't tell where the woman was looking because the artist, who was probably a pervert, seemed to have forgotten to draw her head. The caption read, "Male pattern blindness." Stupid, right? So I whited out the caption, and when it dried, I wrote my own caption over it. "Look at that guy with the head." Then I stuck it to the corkboard to see if I would get promoted, but no one noticed.
Okay, this is a great example of a section that is hilarious and also shows that Mike Long is an idiot in some ways.
The previous caption was better, I have to say.
Yes. He also takes a nap under his desk at one point, at which point I'm thinking there's a lot of Seinfeld references here. The whole New Yorker cartoon thing with Elaine Bennis, and she's so frustrated she never understands them, and then, the nap under I was like, okay, there's some
kind
good...
of the woman who never shows up, too. That could
Nice.
be very Seinfeld. Of like,
Yeah, totally. That's
but,
a good...
But there's a reason why Seinfeld was so successful. It's funny. It's good. Dave, you had flagged
Absolutely.
a section that you wanted to read as well?
Yeah, sure, I do. This one's a little bit longer. This is this is a conversation that Mike Long is having with his dad about kind of a past event, a past incident involving one of the female characters a long time ago when she was in high school. And the dad was a high school English teacher. So that's a bit of the context of this couple pages here. Harvard dad, or at least Vassar. I could have gone to Vassar, I seethed. He turned his head slowly from side to side, unsurprised but aware that I, or at least someone, was in the room. "Do you know what kind of doors Vassar can open for a young philosopher?" I said. He opened his eyes. It took them a long time to focus, longer to find me, and when they did, they didn't show any sign of recognition, much less concern. "Do you?" I said, raising the volume. And when he didn't answer, I brought the hammer down. "Neither do I, because I never went to Vassar." I could tell I'd been recognized, but the sheer effort it took had me losing steam. I tried to keep it going. Or Amherst, or Bates, or Bowdoin, or, I mumbled, at least Bucknell. I was capable of going on longer. I had memorized the U.S. News and World Report rankings every year since I'd graduated high school and could recite them in numerical or alphabetical order. Obviously, this time I had chosen alphabetical. But my father had heard all that before, was used to it by now, already preparing to dismiss me. What he doesn't know was that I had new evidence, an eyewitness account, a personal confession, and I had to get to it before he went back to watching unproduced movies on his eyelids. "I saw her today," I said. His eyes flashed suddenly. I could tell he was fully present and that somehow he knew who I meant. He glazed over on purpose, but I had him. "Who?" he said. "Don't play dumb," I said. He closed his eyes, and at first I thought he'd managed to nod off again. But when he brought his sagging arm up to his clammy forehead, I could tell he was thinking. He finally spoke. "Son, I dreamed of permanent revolution, but what I got was perpetual war. It wasn't my choice to make." Ever since the doctors got him hooked, he sounded more like an oracle than a philosopher, but I could usually get some sense out of him. "She said nothing happened," I said. "She said you didn't do anything." He replied more quickly than I expected. "She told you the facts, son, but not the truth. I did not lay a hand on her, nor did I say a word. I did not even look much her way, just a glance in the mirror every now and then. She was draped across the back seat, intoxicated and vulnerable. Her vulnerability did not appeal to me, son. For me, the strong-willed girl of slightly above-average intelligence, stone sober if a little run down and irritable at the tail end of a long school day, seeking out ways to argue the intersection of classic literature and current affairs. Hemingway and abortion, Eliot and sex work, James Joyce and coprophilia. That was the version of her that filled my mind as I drove her drunken husk home. In my head, she was the initiator, and the things she initiated were glorious but unspeakable, and so I will speak no more of them, son, except to say that at the height of our imaginary passion, I looked into the mirror to refresh my memory of the actual thing and met her eyes, or rather, her eyes' reflection. She was staring at me as aggressively as she had in my fantasies, but her gaze did not express desire, son. it expressed awareness, as though my own eyes were projecting the scene in my brain out onto the mirror where she could see it in reverse. She knew, son, not vaguely, but in high-definition detail. She knew the placement of every limb, every appendage, the velocity and viscosity of each drop of sweat and fluid on our bodies in my mind's eye. And she knew that I knew that she knew, because that look of awareness slipped briefly into horror before ossifying into disgust. A look of disgust she maintained defiantly until the very moment we pulled up in front of her parents' house, son. That look told me she would scorch my earth if she could, and I was impressed, aroused, and devastated. She did say you were a little weird on the drive home, I said. That's just the thing, son, he said. It wasn't weird. It was perfectly normal. It was the way of things. If anything, her acknowledgement of it was weird. That was the innovation, a tactic only, son, indicating a new strategy, a nuclear option, that of not allowing me, or any man, I'd guess, to imagine those things in her presence, or to delight in the belief that she knew and could do nothing about it. The only thing, soldier, was to retreat, but our retreat was not tactical, it was strategic. Endless retreat. I have consulted with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we are in complete agreement. It was ironic, him using this extended military metaphor, considering he'd dodged the Vietnam draft by wearing lace panties to his exam, pubic hair trimmed into the shape of a heart. He'd admitted it when I came back to my dorm room on September 11th, 2001. He told me those methods wouldn't work anymore, and he was going to have to shoot me in the foot, was all ready to head over to Walmart and buy a gun. I managed to convince him to wait until I was at least called up. Now here he was talking like he was the commander-in-chief himself, the old man at the diner, his trusted war cabinet. Isn't that kind of a grandiose way to talk about the battle of the sexes, I said. Is that what you think, son, the battle of the sexes? What I'm talking about is the war on terror, and I am terror, son, which I suppose makes you terror's son. It was the oracle of the temple of Apollo at Delphi that declared Socrates the wisest man alive. But here's the thing about oracles. They were just old ladies in caves getting high off ethylene fumes that rose up from a crack in the ground and rambling. There was no reason to listen to them, just like there was no reason to listen to my father.
I'm going to bring you on my next tour, Dave.
Sure, I'm happy to join you. There's obviously some great stuff about fathers and sons there, and those are deep themes in a lot of the books that we tend to like and talk about on the show. I also put it together today that's something that Mary Carr said to you on September
That's right.
15th, 2001. You just started teaching. She said, we're going to have to shoot you in the foot so that you don't get drafted.
You got it.
And then I was like, oh, that's in the book. And then I went back and I was like, there it is.
Yep.
I heard that on another podcast. Little inside tip.
When you were reading that, Dave, I realized that I also did want to read a section of the book, and
awesome.
This is a section. Starts on the page that does have the one mention of Kierkegaard in the book, and makes a lot more sense to me now that we're talking to the author himself. But I think it's maybe my favorite part of the book, so I'm just going to start. I'm not even going to set it up. I'm just going to read it. April bent down and gave me a kiss on the cheek and then left, leaving me with a lot of questions, first among them being how April could know she would see me tomorrow, that is Sunday, when we hadn't made any plans and I didn't have any plans she could know about. The thing about a world that exists, you can have a lot of questions and all possible answers seem pretty random until they happen, at which point they start to have to be kind of inevitable. Take April's random comment, for example. What did she meant by that? That she just randomly picked a guy in the park and it happened to be me, or was she using it more colloquially, as in I was just walking through the park, saw a guy I was attracted to, and I randomly decided to follow him home? Because everything exists, there are all these thoughts running through my head, but also running through hers. So what seems random to me, and maybe also to her, is not actually random, but the combined existences of us interacting, which is beautiful even if the outcome is bad. And I'm not just saying that because I already know the outcome of this particular interaction, or at least part of it. So I decided to head home and just think all night about the seduction and what would happen after the seduction, about what I would be when I was no longer office manager, which I decided would be soon because it did not seem an appropriate career ambition in a world that existed. about thinking and how we can share and understand the thoughts that happen between us and ask a lot of questions and not worry about the answers, which is the beginning of philosophy. And to that, I would say, and interviewing someone. And that, there's also another part of the book which I really like too, which is about like meeting someone. And when he first meets April Curtis, he sort of has this preconceived idea of her. But what I find really beautiful about it is like, this is what really matters. It's like meeting someone can change your life. Having a conversation with someone can be the most important thing that ever happens to you. And he feels like aware of that. But maybe I'm misreading it. I mean, was that ironic or sincere, Christian?
It was absolutely sincere. It's the very first short story I ever wrote was it was called Took and Lost, and it was about this the main character is going around trying to figure out who took something from him, and it was just that by interacting with somebody, the person who took something from him stole his sense of life's meaninglessness. You know what I mean? So
that's a good thing to steal, I guess.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the basis of everything I think and write, basically. That's really, really corny to say aloud, which is why I write long stories to obscure that fact. You know,
to couch.
But that's exactly it.
And I was also thinking before we were talking to you today about like, if I wrote a book like this, would I even really want to talk about it that much? Because like your whole thing is like about indirect communication, and I'm like, maybe we should just like play a version like some online video game and like indirectly talk about some ideas that then if you had read this book would also make sense. So like, what kind of like, reader did you have in mind? I mean, this is a shitty question, but like, what kind of reader did you have in mind? Like, what kind of, are you writing for an audience of a person? Obviously you have readers who you're going to have to send this to, and they're going to read your work. But like when you're in the act of writing it, like, who do you really imagine that you're writing for?
I've kind of gotten to this place where I remember when I was working on my very first book, I was in grad school, and there was this conversation about who you write for, and it had literally never occurred to me that you write for anybody but yourself. And one of my classmates was like, "Well, that's masturbatory," and I was like, "Well, writing for someone else is masturbation with porn, then." And like
that's funny.
The worst things get for me. Like, writing is supposed to be a fun and joyful act. It should never be painful or frustrating to me. And the only times it has been is when I slip and start thinking about like literally anybody else. The book I'm working on right now, I joked on a previous podcast and also on social media that there's a point in every book I'm writing where I know that I have gone beyond the bounds of propriety and therefore can't make money on it and will only be, embraced by, weirdos. And that's freeing to me, and it allows me to say what I want to say honestly. And so, I know Adam Levin and my brother are the two people that I show my work to before I ever show it to an editor. And I know that sometimes they like it and sometimes they don't, but they're going to be honest with me in their reactions. But also I know that I can't piss either of them off. But otherwise I put very, very little thought into it, just because there was this weird brief moment where agents were coming to me, and it was without my ever having put any thought into that. And I was like, well, maybe I can make money. Maybe there is a mainstream audience for this. And that it was, like 3 years of frustration that was totally counterproductive,
Right. You told that anecdote about like your thesis supervisor or someone being like, if you want to have like more than 4 readers, you need to start writing different kind of stories.
Yeah. Yep.
So like, who do you imagine your 4 readers to be, Christian? Adam, your brother, Matt, and Dave.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, what's been great about that is I actually think, I think there's a bunch of us, but I think by just kind of sticking to that, there's like I have a bunch of people, not even who necessarily in cases that are like aesthetically similar to me, like I don't know if you know Blake Butler, but Blake Butler and I are not similar writers at all. You know what I mean? But I remember he was getting attention at the same time I first started getting attention, and it was like there was this kind of it turned out that there were 8 instead of 4. You know what I mean? And then 16 instead of 8, and I mean it's not going to go beyond 24. But that's
and he got grouped in with a bunch of other writers that were like in a very, I would say, reductive idea of like what is like postmodernism. Right. It's sort of the Mo Sizlak idea of like weird for the sake of being weird, and it's like, well, that's not really a grouping. And I mean, he was grouped in with like Tao Lin and maybe even Amelia Gray and some other writers who were just taking risks. But there's all kinds of risks, and like even like Chuck Palahniuk, like writing about some really graphic violence is not so much taking a risk as like trying to subvert the idea of like fiction or Aristotle's Poetics or whatever. So like I think that's really a shitty way, and I think there are plenty of smart readers who can make those distinctions and do like, yes, is it ever going to be enough to just work off of, where you don't have any other job and your wife doesn't have any other job and you have a massive family? Like, probably not. Like, you'd probably have to be Stephen King to do that. But I really do admire writers like you who take those risks and stick to it, no matter what, and not play to like, oh, I'm going to go now try to write a commercial novel.
Well, I should also point out that I'm actually very great. I mean, like I really was, when it was Arthur Flowers, who, by the way, is one of my favorite people ever, and also he's an amazing writer and mentor. And he knew that I knew what he was saying when he said you're going to have 4 readers. But it's the thing is every reader over 4. I'm not grateful for the 4 of you that I know will read it, but but the rest of the every time, and it's very strange to be like this book got 1 review. I've been on a bunch of podcasts, but this book got 1 proper review, and yet still, like, there will be people that will tag me into a Twitter post saying I just read this and it's funny, and it's like I'm very grateful that that's happening. Yeah, and
It does happen.
You can be,
it does happen, because I also think there are people who are also looking for something, that is not mainstream, right? It is not going to just feed into a predictable structure, a predictable nature. They're looking for something that, you get the same thing with music or films or anything. Like with books, there are people who are like, I want something that's maybe more at the edges of the mainstream sensibility. But I actually don't think there's anything too, like you said, you didn't go completely off the rails in this book. This book is pretty well restrained, and I feel like,
Oh yeah, like I feel like Teflahoma is like way off the rails. And Ghost Engine too. Like, this is pretty normal.
Well, Teflahoma was a direct reaction to when people were reading this and were like, it's still really weird, and I was like, well, I'll show you
see some weird shit.
That's awesome. And then in terms of like press too, you have Adam Levin immortalizing you in his forthcoming novel Mount Chicago in a couple places. This is kind of telegraphing our next guest a little bit, but like, here's a passage from page 101 there. He says, he possessed 2 shelves of books by writers who Gladman had praised in interviews: DeLillo, Kafka, Pacheco, Roth, Elkin, Paley, O'Connor, Percival Everett, Saunders, Cervantes, Hanna, Era, Paul Beatty, Hellebeck, Bordas, Vonnegut, Milhauser, Paget Powell, Ellison, Elroy, Castellans, Moya, Bernhard, Bove, Lydia Davis, Nicholson Baker, yada yada, Helen DeWitt, Christian TeBordo, and of course Gogol, and a bunch of other names.
Paget Powell, also one of your blurbers. I assume maybe a teacher of yours?
Yes.
Was he a teacher?
No, he wasn't. He's actually, Powell's kind of my hero. Wow. And I've never met him. I've never interacted with him in any formal way. And I sent him a request. The blurb is unhinged.
It's nuts.
It's awesome. Yeah.
But he, he was like, he replied like, no one will publish my blurbs anymore, and also I'm more or less illiterate. And I was like, well, I work with small presses, so I can override any veto. Like, I can guarantee your blurb will go on the back. And I was like, I won't change a thing. And so I'm very proud of that.
I'll read it. I have it handy. Paget Powell says, I am the blurber and you the blurbed at. And beyond that truism, we shall eschew the literary within this utterance. The apology is damned weird business. To attempt explication is to sound even dumber, but who cares? I do not mean the typical pushed strange weird. I mean the weird of the pushed banal, the mundane taken to some kind of fascinating negative power. If you want some damned weird business, take Mr. TeBordo home with you. That's a hell of a blurb there. And Paget Powell is the teacher of one of our former guests, who was Dr. Rob Short. And maybe a fishing buddy of his as well. I think he's a big fisherman.
Rob loves his
anyways,
fishing.
Where can people find this book? What would be the best way for people to support you, Christian? Buy it directly from the publisher, small? No, small.
Well, honestly, I think the publisher is Astrophil Press is probably the best place. But honestly, I just want the word out. We're I had somebody like pop up in my DMs on Twitter being like, I don't even like reading print books. But your book is not available as an ebook. Do you have a PDF? I was like, sure, here you go.
Wow. That's not available to all of our listeners.
I've never heard someone with that problem.
That's not available to all of our listeners. We're going to cut that out.
It was a very limited edition PDF.
It's out of print now.
First come, first serve.
It's out of print now.
The PDF stuff.
But no, I can't recommend this
Files corrupted.
Highly enough. When I'm going to bring it back to Wallace one more time, just like when we were talking about Wallace earlier and the Pale King. I think some of his best work is in the Pale King, and a lot of what's in here reminded me of the Pale King. Your ability to write monologues and dialogues at happy hour is really reminiscent of some of my most treasured memories of reading stuff that I've ever read. So I give it a really high marks for that stuff, and all of those other people who rejected it.
That's where Henry gets it from.
Yes, I had to give it in honor. Any other final thoughts from you, Dave, before we move on?
Yeah, I got to ask you about the cover. So the cover is like a Greco-Roman sculpture of a nude woman. And I'm trying to think, is this Athena? Is this Antigone? I know Oedipus and Antigone get mentioned in the book. Tell us about the origin of the Greco-Roman statuary on the cover and how it relates to the book.
All right. So it really is there because of the kind of the focus on classical culture and philosophy that the narrator uses, and how the obvious cover would have just been to reproduce the Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David.
Sure.
But so this kind of evokes this in a kind of inappropriate way, just because it's not really
with the male gaze a little bit.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of focus on breasts in the book and stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
But it was funny because the publisher of Astrophil Press is this guy Duncan Barlow, and he's great to work with, and a really good writer in his own right. But I was really pushing him to break design rules while we did it, and we didn't end up breaking that many. I think the it's got a kind of classical symmetry almost to the cover, but I was trying to get him to be like, let's put the title on the bottom and just have this statue floating above it and my name appear nowhere on it and stuff like that, because I wanted to because the thing is that I feel like there's this when you're reading the book, there should be this sense that things are flowing smoothly and going from point A to point B in a natural way. But I think this conversation has kind of shown that it really doesn't. That it's not like there's not a really coherent
interviewing style.
No. You guys are great. I'm saying there's not really a coherent way to talk about what I meant to do with the book. I don't think, and I want to kind of express that. And in the same way, the interior layout, it's the chapter titles are on the verso page half the time, and it's cluttered and weird. Like,
Well,
I
the
don't know,
epigraphs,
so,
you've got all these cross outs too, like the strike through.
Right.
It's almost like the guy couldn't get his shit together. But actually, I really love the cover of this book, because if you had put Socrates on the cover and it said the apology, I feel like that would give it a false sense of, people would pick it up at this, and be like, oh, this is all about Socrates or something. And it's really not. Like, it's not, it's its own thing. And like the ambiguity of, who is this woman on there matches with the ambiguity of, finding out who this woman is in the book.
Yeah.
And I also want to say one other thing about that, which is that reveal of like, who is this woman? It's really hard to do in prose. Like, there are some things that are really hard to do in audio. Like, I can't show a chart or a graph. Like, I can do really good, music and sounds and build up suspense that way. But if I want to say like, just trust me, she was incredibly beautiful. Like, you can do that better in film, right? Like, you can actually go and like cast a really beautiful woman. But in prose and something where it's a like visual medium like that, I think it's very hard, to do that. And you achieved it with April Curtis. So.
Well, I appreciate that. I think the reason is because I'm a totally non-visual person. So if I had described 3 things, then that's all I see. You know what I mean?
I think that works in this case. That's to your advantage. So, Christian TeBordo.
How do you describe the way that you visualize characters' faces in books, Christian?
I don't know. I talked to my...
This is kind of a goof question, because there's a part in Mount Chicago where Adam, or the character, asks you this, and then you write back in an email that's childish bullshit.
Actually, we talk about Kyle Beachy with this. A whole book called this book, Peter Mendelsohn, What We See When We Read. He's obsessed with that question of like, can you visualize Anna Karenina based on this description? And actually, I realized as a reader, I don't give a shit. Like, I don't have to think, I don't have to like visualize someone's face. And often when I visualize the narrator, it's me.
Yeah, I really don't. I have a trouble visualizing, in any great specific anybody. It's funny. My wife is a choreographer, choreographer by training. She does a lot of arts and administration now. But my son was talking to me about this. He does these kind of like weird kind of physical routines sometimes. He's 11. He just likes to act out. And I was like, well, where is this story coming from? And he's like, I see the next move in my head like a half a second before I do it. And then I do it. And I was like, that's just completely foreign to the way I do things. So like when I'm writing a story, I think for the benefit of coherence, sometimes I have to describe something and I'll just stop and try to real hard to make something up. It's when I walk into a room, maybe I'll notice 3 things in the entire room, and those are the things that get thrown into there,
That's awesome.
I am excited about your mention of a forthcoming book, so please, you don't have to talk about it, but like, just keep writing, keep doing your thing. It's awesome.
We'll keep reading them.
We do have a special bonus segment coming up, but Christian, where I know you're on Twitter, where else is that your preferred method of people want to get your witticisms on a regular basis?
Yeah,
and like people should know that your Twitter is like so off the wall. Like 99% of the time, I'm like, I think he's joking here and just being ironic. I'm pretty sure. Like, the voice of it is wonderful. I love it.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it's pure bullshit. On principle, unless I break down and say a book is good, you know what I mean? Like I mean it when I say a book is good, but for the most part,
you know what? And in fact, you're one of the only other tweets. I remember your tweet specifically about a book that I tweeted about, which is Magnetic Fields. And Ron Lowenson. And
I just emailed a local bookstore about that book today. I'm trying to get a hold of it.
And probably recommended to me by the same person who recommended it to you. Maybe. But I really love that book. I went looking for more tweets about it, and like I think one of the only tweets in existence on that book is Christian TeBordo's tweet about magnetic fields. So if our listeners have not read that book, I would recommend it.
Is the band named after this book, do you think?
No, I think it's a generic term, magnetic fields.
Yeah, I'm not sure who. I mean, the book definitely predates the band.
It's from like 85 or something.
82,
right?
But
83.
It's weird because
82.
as a Dalkey diehard, I had always been looking out for it, but that was one book that I never came across. And then Levin was like, "You have to read it." He read it like last year, and I was like, "Well, I've always meant to." And then I this time I've special ordered it, and it's interesting because this is a conversation that Kyle Beachy and I have all the time about. I'm usually bullshitting, but I'm actually not joking when I say End Zone is Don DeLillo's best book. But
I've never read that one actually. There's like a handful of his early books that I still haven't read.
That's like the
but I've
one
read, like,
Infinite. If you're going to read
80% of
Infinite
them.
Jest, read. God damn it.
Yeah, right.
But Kyle Beachy is has been my colleague for about a decade, and he really, and he is not joking when he says that he thinks late period DeLillo is the best DeLillo. He loves Point Omega, which I like,
Right.
it's
It's
not white
fine to
noise,
me.
you know what I mean? But
No, nothing.
but like Kyle will throw down with you, and I was like, to me, Magnetic Fields is this kind of weird transition between each of DeLillo's periods. It's like it reads a lot like DeLillo, but it predates DeLillo's major periods. It's great.
And there's a lot in there about
It's a good comparison.
audio production, and it kind of
Yep.
applies to
Hey,
if
I could
you're
dig that.
podcasting. It's just a really fantastic book. So, anyways, that alone
Sweet.
is worth following Christian
Good
TeBordo on Twitter for. What is your
Yes, it's
X
X
TeBordo,
TeBordo,
Christian
yeah.
TeBordo. Okay.
Nice. We'll link it in the show notes. Matt, where can folks
We are
find
Concavity
us?
Show on Twitter and Instagram, and people can email us concavityshow@gmail.com.
That's right. We have Facebook, but who cares about that? We have some new patrons this month. We want to say thank you so much to Dylan Lackey, to Ben Hansen, and to Andrew Merritt. Thanks, guys, for joining the team. We so appreciate your support there. And speaking of being a patron, if you want to hear more from Christian TeBordo, we're going to be talking in our next segment, our bonus episode with him, about 5 great books that he's going to tell us about. We always want to also thank Parquet Courts for their songs Instant Disassembly and Tenderness that accompany our shows. We want to thank Chris Ayers for his logo design. And it's always worth giving a shout out to Robin O'Neill for her original logo design for our show as well. Thanks, Robin. And incidentally, I got to hang out with Chris Ayers a couple weeks ago in Vancouver, Matt. So that was fun to catch up. We had our own little Wallace 22 conference together. Us sad people who couldn't make it to Austin.
That's great. I'm glad you got to meet up.
Christian, thanks.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
being here.
Catch me now as I say, into darkness, I thought to be extinct.
Oh, yeah.
You can totally ignore us, too. That's totally fine.
Impossible. You guys are too charismatic.
That's what I like to hear. Sucking up to the host.
I mean, I'll take that. Yeah, sure.